Sometimes life puts us through the deepest humiliation to prepare us for our greatest blessings. In that house where I raised my boy with all my love, I became invisible to everyone, except the little granddaughter who needed me most. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Dorothy Mae Henderson, but everyone calls me Dottie. Today I'm 89 years old, and my heart is full of stories that need to be told. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It brings such joy to know my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I went from being a loving grandmother to being declared dead by my own family, and how I fought for 20 long years to prove I was still alive. This story begins in Frankfort, Kentucky, where I spent my whole life believing that family love could overcome anything. Boy, was I wrong about that. It all started when my only son Bobby brought home a city girl named Vanessa, and I thought I was getting the daughter I never had. Instead, I got the nightmare that would steal my granddaughter from me and make me disappear from my own family's life. Let me take you back to where it all began, because every grandmother watching this needs to know that what happened to me could happen to anyone. I was 69 when Bobby first brought Vanessa Claire Morrison to our little house on Maple Street. Lord, she was everything I wasn't. College educated with her business degree from the University of Louisville, sophisticated in ways I'd only seen in magazines, wearing clothes that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, selling my homemade preserves at the farmer's market. Her family had money, real money, the kind that came from generations of smart investments and proper connections. But despite our differences, I wanted so desperately to be the mother-in-law she deserved. I'd lost my dear husband Harold 5 years earlier, and Bobby was all the family I had left in this world. When he looked at Vanessa with those lovesick eyes, talking about marriage and babies and building a life together, I knew I had to make this work. So I did what any mother would do. I spent every penny of Harold's life, insurance money fixing up that old house, painting every room in colors I thought a city girl would appreciate, buying new furniture from Mitchell's Fine Furniture downtown instead of my usual thrift shops and estate sales. I even had central air conditioning installed, something I'd never had in all my 70 years, just so she'd be comfortable during those hot Kentucky summers. The contractor looked at me like I was crazy, spending that much money on a house that was older than dirt. But I didn't care. This was my investment in my son's happiness, in my future daughter-in-law's comfort, in the grandchildren I was already dreaming about. The wedding was small but beautiful, held right there in our backyard under the old oak tree where Bobby used to swing as a boy. I cooked for 3 days straight, making all his favorite dishes and trying my best to impress her family, who drove down from Louisville in their expensive cars with their fancy clothes and their subtle looks of disapproval. Her mother, Patricia Morrison, looked at my china cabinet like it had crawled out of a swamp, running her manicured fingers along the edges and making little comments about vintage pieces that I knew weren't meant as compliments. But I smiled and served them my grandmother's sweet tea recipe anyway, the one that had been in our family for 4 generations, and watched as they politely sipped it while probably wishing for something store-bought and predictable. Vanessa seemed happy enough that day, hugging me and calling me Mama Dottie in front of everyone, telling her friends how lucky she was to have such a caring mother-in-law. I thought I'd finally found my place in her heart, that we were going to be the family I'd always dreamed of having. Those first few months living together felt like a dream come true. 3 generations under one roof, just like when I was growing up on my grandmother's farm. I'd wake up early to make breakfast for the newlyweds, pack Bobby's lunch for the tire plant, and spend my days planning for the grandchildren I was sure would come soon. Vanessa would sit at my kitchen table drinking coffee and telling me about her day at the accounting firm where she worked, and I'd listen like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. I wanted so badly to be part of her life, to matter to her the way she mattered to my son. But slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice at first, things began to change. My favorite throw pillows, the ones I'd crocheted myself with roses and forget-me-nots, disappeared from the living room. When I asked about them, Vanessa smiled sweetly and said they were being cleaned, but they never came back. The family photos I'd arranged so carefully on the mantel, pictures of Harold and me on our wedding day, Bobby's baby pictures, snapshots of family reunions and holidays, got rearranged, then moved to a less prominent spot, then disappeared altogether into a box in the closet. We need more space for our own memories, Vanessa explained when I found them packed away like relics from a museum. You understand, don't you, Mama Dottie? I did understand, or at least I told myself I did. Young wives needed to make their own mark on a home, create their own sense of place and belonging. But when I asked about my grandmother's antique serving bowls that had been in the kitchen for decades, the ones my own mother had used to serve Sunday dinner to our family, Vanessa's smile got a little tighter. They're being cleaned, she said, but I never saw them again. Later, I found them in a yard sale across town, sold to strangers who had no idea they were holding pieces of my family's history in their hands. She replaced my herb garden, the one I'd tended for 20 years, with ornamental plants that looked pretty but couldn't season a pot of beans if your life depended on it. Every change felt like a tiny erasure of who I was and who my family had been. But I convinced myself this was normal, that love meant making sacrifices and adjustments. The real changes started in the kitchen, my domain, the place where I'd always felt most like myself. Vanessa began suggesting improvements, newer appliances to replace the ones that had served me faithfully for decades. Different spices to replace the ones I'd been using since I learned to cook from my mother. New recipes from cooking shows instead of the family dishes that Bobby had grown up loving. Times are changing, Mama Dottie, she'd say with that patient tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. People are more health conscious now, more aware of nutrition and proper food preparation. I bit my tongue when she threw away my mother's recipe cards, the handwritten ones stained with decades of use, saying they were unsanitary because they weren't laminated or typed. Those stains were memories, the splash of molasses from Christmas cookies, the flour fingerprint from Sunday biscuits, the coffee ring from the card I'd consulted every Thanksgiving for 30 years. But I stayed quiet, believing that love meant swallowing your pride and adapting to change. When Bobby came home from work, he was so tired from his double shifts at the tire plant that he barely noticed the transformation happening around him. Vanessa would serve him dinner on the new dishes, and he'd compliment her cooking, not realizing half the recipes were mine, just prepared differently and plated on unfamiliar china. I'd sit there watching them, feeling like a ghost in my own home. But I convinced myself this was what happiness looked like. I was getting my son's love secondhand, filtered through a woman who was slowly erasing every trace of the life I'd built in that house. But the real changes hadn't even started yet. The worst was still coming, and it would begin with the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's first cry, echoing through the halls of a house that was no longer really mine. Emma Grace Henderson came into this world on a snowy February morning, and I swear I fell in love before the doctor even placed her in my arms. She had Bobby's dark hair and my late husband's blue eyes, and when she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine for the first time, I knew my purpose in life had just gotten a whole lot bigger and more important than anything I'd ever done before. For the first few weeks after they brought her home from the hospital, Vanessa seemed genuinely grateful for my help. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning to prepare bottles, warm them to the perfect temperature, change diapers with the efficiency that only comes from years of experience, and rock that precious baby back to sleep so her mama could rest and recover from the delivery. I sang her the same lullabies I'd sung to Bobby 30 years earlier, told her stories about her great-grandmother and great-grandfather, and showed her the family photos that Vanessa had hidden away in that box. Those quiet morning hours with Emma, when the house was still and peaceful, and it was just the two of us in the old rocking chair by the window, were the happiest I'd been since Harold passed away. I felt useful again, needed, like I had a reason to wake up every morning and face another day. But as the weeks turned into months and Emma grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby, Vanessa's gratitude began to transform into something else entirely, something that made my stomach clench with worry and confusion. She started making rules about when I could hold Emma, how long I could keep her, and what I was allowed to feed her. My homemade baby food, carefully prepared from vegetables I grew myself in the garden that used to be mine, was suddenly too risky because it wasn't store-bought and approved by pediatricians. The wooden rocking horse that Bobby had played with as a child, the one Harold had carved with his own hands during those long winter evenings when I was pregnant, was declared a safety hazard and moved to the garage where it collected dust and spider webs. Even the lullabies I sang, the ones passed down through generations of women in my family, were too stimulating before nap time and needed to be replaced with classical music from CDs that Vanessa ordered online. Research shows became her favorite phrase, always followed by some study or expert opinion that contradicted everything I knew about raising children. I tried to explain that I'd raised Bobby just fine with those same methods, that he'd grown up healthy and strong and loving without store-bought baby food or educational toys or structured activity schedules. But Vanessa would smile that tight, patient smile and say times had changed, that we knew better now, that what worked 30 years ago wasn't necessarily best for children today. Each rule felt like a small knife cutting away at my connection to my granddaughter, making me ask permission to love my own grandchild in what used to be my own home. I started second-guessing every instinct, every gesture of affection, every attempt to share the wisdom I'd gained from decades of motherhood. Was I holding her wrong? Was I talking too loudly? Was my very presence somehow harmful to this precious child I loved more than my own life? The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, when I was feeding Emma some mashed carrots I'd made myself, the same recipe I'd used for Bobby 30 years earlier, pureed to the perfect consistency and seasoned with just a tiny pinch of the herbs from my garden. Emma was giggling and making happy baby noises, opening her mouth like a little bird every time she saw the spoon coming, getting more food on her face than in her mouth, but clearly enjoying every minute of our lunch together. That's when Vanessa walked into the kitchen and saw what we were doing. Her face went white, then red, then white again, and she crossed the room in 3 quick steps to snatch the spoon from my hand like I was feeding her child poison instead of homemade vegetables. "Dottie, we talked about this," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass and loud enough to make Emma start crying. "Emma needs proper nutrition, not whatever you think is good for her. You raised Bobby in a different time, but we know better now. We have to follow modern guidelines, use approved foods, stick to the schedule her pediatrician recommended." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one carefully chosen to remind me that my experience meant nothing, that my love was inadequate, that I was somehow failing this child by caring for her the same way I'd cared for her father. Different time. Like love and care had expiration dates. Like the wisdom I'd gained from raising a child and keeping him healthy and happy meant nothing because I didn't have a college degree or subscribe to parenting magazines written by strangers who'd never held Emma in their arms or sung her to sleep. That night, I cried for the first time since Harold's funeral, muffling my sobs with a pillow so they wouldn't hear me down the hall and think I was being dramatic or attention-seeking. I was becoming a stranger in my own home, an unwelcome guest in my granddaughter's life, and I didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong, so quickly. The next morning, I overheard Vanessa on the phone with her mother, talking in hushed tones in the living room, while she thought I was outside hanging laundry. I caught fragments of their conversation through the thin walls. Too attached, interfering, need to set boundaries. She doesn't understand modern parenting. When she saw me listening through the window, she quickly ended the call and came outside with that fake smile plastered across her face like a mask. "Everything okay, Mama Dottie?" she asked, but her eyes were cold and calculating. That's when I realized this wasn't about different parenting styles or generational differences or modern research versus old-fashioned methods. This was about power, control, and slowly pushing me out of my own family's life so that Vanessa could have Bobby and Emma all to herself, with no interference from the woman who'd raised the man she married. The war for my granddaughter's heart had begun in earnest, and I was losing battles I didn't even know I was fighting. The woman I'd welcomed into my home with open arms, the daughter-in-law I'd tried so hard to love and support, was systematically destroying everything I held dear, one small victory at a time. And the worst part was that Bobby, tired from working double shifts and trusting his wife to handle domestic matters, had no idea what was happening right under his nose. By Emma's first birthday, I'd been relegated to visitor status in my own home, asking permission to hold my granddaughter and being granted brief, supervised visits, like I was some kind of threat, instead of the woman who'd loved her since before she was born. Vanessa had convinced Bobby that I was overwhelming the baby with too much attention, that I needed to respect their parenting choices and step back to give them space to raise their daughter their way. The birthday party was a perfect example of how completely I'd been erased from what should have been a family celebration. Vanessa hired a professional photographer from Louisville, ordered a custom cake from an expensive bakery that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and invited all her college friends and work colleagues. My neighbors, the people who'd watched Bobby grow up and had been part of our family's life for decades, weren't invited. When I suggested we include Mrs. Patterson from next door, or the Johnsons from down the street, people who'd known Emma since she was born and wanted to celebrate with us, Vanessa said the guest list was already full, and maybe next year there would be room for more people. The decorations were all pink and gold, store-bought and elegant, professionally arranged like something from a magazine spread. There were no family traditions, no songs passed down through generations, no homemade decorations or personal touches that connected Emma to her heritage and history. I felt like I was watching someone else's child's birthday party, sitting in a corner of my own living room, while strangers celebrated my granddaughter's first year of life. The final straw came 3 weeks later, when Emma took her first steps. I was sitting on the floor playing with her, building towers with colorful blocks, while she babbled and laughed, when she suddenly let go of the coffee table and wobbled 3 perfect, precious steps into my waiting arms. My heart nearly burst with joy as I scooped her up, spinning her around and praising her accomplishment, calling for Bobby and Vanessa to come see what their brilliant daughter had just done. But when they rushed into the room instead of sharing my excitement and pride, Vanessa's face went white with anger and something that looked almost like rage. "You should have called us first," she snapped, taking Emma from my arms like I'd stolen something that belonged to her. Those were her first steps. We should have seen them first. We're her parents. As if love operated on a hierarchy. As if being a grandmother made me less deserving of witnessing those precious milestones. As if my joy in Emma's accomplishments was somehow taking something away from theirs. That night, Bobby sat me down for what he called a family meeting, though it felt more like a trial where I was the defendant and he was reading a verdict that had already been decided. With Vanessa beside him, her hand on his arm like she was coaching him through a script she'd written, he told me they'd decided I needed my own space, my own life, separate from theirs. "Mom, you've been so generous letting us live here," he said, not meeting my eyes, staring at his hands while he spoke the words that would change everything. "But Vanessa and I think it would be better for everyone if we had our own place, and maybe you could find somewhere smaller, more manageable for you." Manageable. Like I was a problem that needed solving, a burden that needed to be lightened, an inconvenience that needed to be addressed. They'd already found me an apartment across town, a tiny one-bedroom place above the old pharmacy on Main Street, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a store that sold used appliances. They'd even paid the first month's rent and security deposit, presenting it like a generous gift instead of what it really was, an eviction notice disguised as concern for my welfare. "You'll have more freedom," Vanessa added with that smile that never reached her eyes, the one I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. "No responsibilities, no one to worry about but yourself. It'll be like a vacation from all the stress of helping with the baby. A vacation from my own granddaughter. A vacation from the family I'd sacrificed everything to build and maintain and hold together." I was 70 years old, being sent away from the home I'd lived in for 40 years, from the grandchild who'd become my whole world, from the life I'd built with Harold and continued building with Bobby. But what choice did I have? If I fought them, argued or made a scene or demanded my rights as a homeowner and grandmother, I might lose Bobby completely. If I went quietly, swallowed my pride, and accepted their decision with grace, maybe I could still be part of Emma's life, just from a distance. So I packed my belongings into cardboard boxes from the liquor store, each item a memory being folded away and stored, and moved to that little apartment where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbors' television shows and arguments, where the loneliness echoed off every surface and seemed to multiply in the empty spaces. The apartment became my prison, but I tried to make it feel like home by decorating it with photos of Emma and keeping her room ready for visits that I was sure would come regularly. I set up the small second bedroom with a crib I bought secondhand, toys from the dollar store, and books I remembered Bobby loving when he was little. At first, Bobby would bring Emma by every Sunday after church, and those few hours sustained me through the entire week like water in a desert. I'd plan activities for days in advance, bake her favorite cookies using recipes I remembered from Bobby's childhood, set up little games and crafts that would help her learn and grow. Emma would run to me with such joy when she saw me, calling Grandma Dottie in that sweet voice that made everything worth enduring. And we'd spend the afternoon reading books, playing with dolls, and taking walks around the neighborhood while I told her stories about her daddy when he was little. But gradually, so gradually, I almost didn't notice at first. The visits became less frequent and more restricted. Every other Sunday became once a month, then only on major holidays, then only when Vanessa decided I could be trusted not to overstimulate Emma or interfere with their parenting routine. Each cancellation came with a polite excuse. Emma was sick, they had other plans, she was too tired from daycare, they were visiting Vanessa's family in Louisville. I started to feel like I was begging for scraps of my own granddaughter's time, grateful for whatever moments they decided to grant me, like I should be thankful for their generosity, instead of heartbroken by their cruelty. The worst part was watching Emma slowly forget our routines, our special songs, our inside jokes and shared memories. The last time she visited my apartment, she seemed shy around me, looking to Bobby for permission before accepting the cookies I'd made or sitting in my lap to read a book. When I tried to sing our special lullaby, the one about the mockingbird and the diamond ring that I'd sung to her since she was a newborn, she looked at me with confusion and said, "Mommy sings different songs now. She has CDs with real music." Each word was like a nail in the coffin of our relationship, evidence that I was being systematically replaced and erased from her life. During those long, empty months between visits, I started noticing things that should have been red flags much earlier, warning signs I'd been too hopeful and trusting to recognize. Bobby looked tired all the time, stressed in a way I'd never seen before, like he was carrying weights I couldn't see. When I asked how he was doing during our brief phone calls, he'd give vague answers about work being busy or money being tight, never mentioning that Vanessa had convinced him to leave his steady job at the tire plant for something that paid better but required extensive travel. He was gone 3 weeks out of every month now, leaving Vanessa and Emma alone together while he sold insurance in towns across Kentucky and Tennessee. I offered to help with babysitting during his trips, pointing out that it would save them money and give Emma a chance to spend time with family. But Vanessa always had other arrangements already made. Expensive daycare centers or babysitters who charged more in one day than I spent on food in a week. One evening in late summer, I was at the Kroger grocery store, trying to stretch my Social Security check to cover another month of basic necessities, when I overheard 2 women talking in the cereal aisle. One of them mentioned Bobby Henderson, and my ears perked up immediately, hoping to hear news about my son and granddaughter from people who might have seen them around town. "That poor man," one woman said, shaking her head sympathetically. "His wife has him wrapped around her little finger. Did you hear she made him cut off contact with his mother? Claims the old woman was interfering with their marriage, trying to turn the baby against her." My blood turned to ice in my veins. They were talking about me like I was already dead, discussing my family's business like it was public knowledge, spreading gossip that painted me as some kind of meddling mother-in-law who'd driven my own son away through selfishness and interference. The truth was so much more complicated and painful, but gossip always chose the simpler story, the one that fit neatly into people's preconceptions about difficult in-laws and family drama. I wanted to march around that aisle and set the record straight. Tell them what really happened. Explain that I'd been pushed out by a woman who saw me as competition instead of support. But shame kept me frozen in place, clutching my shopping cart full of generic brands and discount items, while strangers discussed the destruction of my family, like it was entertainment. Was this what people thought? That I'd been some kind of interfering busybody who'd brought my own isolation on myself? That night, I called Bobby's number for the first time in several weeks, my hands shaking as I dialed the familiar numbers and listened to the phone ring once, twice, 3 times, before Vanessa's voice answered, cold and professional, like she was taking a business call instead of talking to her husband's mother. "Bobby's not available, Dottie," she said without any warmth or explanation. "He's working late again. Won't be home until after Emma's bedtime." I asked about my granddaughter, about when I might see her next, about whether they'd received the birthday card I'd sent 3 weeks earlier. "We're really busy with the holidays coming up," Vanessa replied, and I could hear Emma's voice in the background, chattering happily about something that didn't include me. "Maybe after the new year we can arrange something, when things calm down and we have more time." But New Year came and went with no call, no visit, no acknowledgement that I existed. Valentine's Day passed, then Easter, then Emma's 2nd birthday, which I learned about from a photo posted on Vanessa's Facebook page that someone at the grocery store mentioned seeing. Each holiday that passed without seeing Emma felt like another small death in my heart, another piece of my identity as a grandmother being carved away and discarded. I started driving by their house at different times of day, hoping to catch a glimpse of my granddaughter playing in the yard or see Bobby's truck in the driveway. But the curtains were always drawn, and the house looked empty, even when I knew they had to be home. It was like they'd vanished from Frankfort entirely, taking Emma with them and leaving me behind with nothing but memories and the echo of a little girl's laughter that grew fainter every day. The isolation was crushing, but worse than the loneliness was the growing certainty that this wasn't temporary, that I wasn't being given time to adjust or prove myself worthy of inclusion in their lives. I was being systematically erased, deleted from Emma's world like I'd never existed at all, and there didn't seem to be anything I could do to stop it. Spring turned to summer, and I hadn't seen Emma in over 8 months. The silence from Bobby was deafening, and my calls went straight to voicemail every single time. I started leaving messages, trying to sound cheerful and normal, instead of desperate and heartbroken. "Hi, sweetie, it's Mom. Just wanted to check on you and Emma. Give me a call when you get a chance." But the chances never came. The voicemail box filled up and stopped accepting new messages, effectively cutting off my last line of communication with my own son. I even tried showing up at the tire plant, where Bobby used to work, thinking maybe he'd gone back to his old job. But his former supervisor told me he'd quit months ago for a better opportunity in Louisville. They'd moved an hour away without telling me, without giving me their new address or phone number, without even the courtesy of a goodbye. I'd been completely cut off from my own family, discarded like an old piece of furniture they no longer needed or wanted, cluttering up their new life. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I spent days just sitting in my apartment, staring at the walls, trying to understand how I'd failed so completely as a mother and grandmother. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to hire someone to find my son and granddaughter, even if it meant spending every penny I had left in the world. Jimmy Patterson had been in Bobby's high school class, the quiet kid who'd grown up to become a private investigator, specializing in missing persons and family reunification cases. I'd seen his advertisement in the Frankfort State Journal and remembered him as a decent boy from a good family. I gave him what little money I had left from selling my mother's jewelry and my wedding ring, asking him to find my son and granddaughter and help me understand why they'd disappeared from my life so completely. 2 weeks later, Jimmy sat across from me in that tiny apartment, his face grim as he spread papers and photographs across my coffee table, like evidence in a criminal case. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice heavy with sympathy and something that looked like anger. "There's something you need to know about your situation. Your daughter-in-law filed a restraining order against you 6 months ago." The words didn't make sense at first, bouncing off my consciousness like stones thrown at a window. Restraining order? Against me? She claimed you were harassing them, making unwanted contact, and that you posed a potential threat to the child's welfare. According to the court documents, you've been calling excessively, sending unwanted gifts, and showing up at their home uninvited. I stared at the legal papers he handed me, seeing my name listed as a defendant like I was some kind of criminal stalker instead of a grandmother who'd been desperately trying to maintain contact with her family. The accusations were lies, twisted versions of my attempts to stay connected to Emma and Bobby. My occasional phone calls, maybe once or twice a week, were described as harassment. The birthday cards and small gifts I'd sent for holidays were labeled unwanted contact. My single visit to their old house when I discovered they'd moved without telling me was characterized as stalking behavior. My love for my granddaughter was being used as evidence against me in a court of law, transformed into something sinister and threatening by a woman who wanted me completely out of their lives. But Jimmy wasn't finished. The worst revelation was yet to come, and when he pulled out another document from the Department of Vital Statistics, my world collapsed entirely. It was a death certificate with my name on it, filed 3 months after they'd moved to Louisville, listing the cause of death as heart failure and giving my age as 71. "She told them you passed away," Jimmy said quietly, watching my face as the full impact of what Vanessa had done hit me like a physical blow. "Your granddaughter thinks you're dead, Mrs. Henderson. They held a memorial service at Morrison Funeral Home and everything. According to everyone who knows them, Dorothy Mae Henderson died peacefully in her sleep and was buried in Frankfort Cemetery." The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Vanessa had done to me, to Bobby, to Emma. She hadn't just cut me out of their lives, she'd erased me completely, killed me off like I was a character in a book she didn't want to read anymore. Emma was growing up believing her grandmother was buried 6 feet underground, that the woman who'd loved her since before birth had simply stopped existing. All those months of wondering why they never called, why my messages weren't returned, why I felt like I was talking to ghosts. It was because I was supposed to be one. "There's more," Jimmy continued, his voice heavy with sympathy and professional outrage. "I did some digging into her background, her previous relationships and family history. She's done this before, Mrs. Henderson. Her first husband, the one before Bobby, she isolated him from his family too, convinced him his sister was trying to break up their marriage. When he finally figured out what was happening and tried to reconnect with his relatives, she'd already cleaned out their bank accounts and disappeared with their daughter. The sister never saw that little girl again, never even knew what happened to her own niece. A pattern. This wasn't about me being inadequate or old-fashioned or unable to adapt to modern parenting methods. This was about control, manipulation, and a woman who collected families like trophies, then systematically destroyed anyone who threatened her absolute power over them. The truth was devastating, but also strangely liberating, like finally getting a diagnosis for an illness that had been making you sick for years, without knowing why. For 2 years, I'd blamed myself, wondered what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a mother and grandmother, what character flaws had made me so unworthy of love that my own family had to escape from me. Now I knew the enemy had a name, a history, and a carefully developed method of operation. Vanessa Claire Morrison Henderson was a predator who'd been hunting my family from the moment she walked through our door. And I'd been too trusting, too hopeful, too decent to recognize the signs until it was almost too late. But knowing the truth and being able to act on it were two entirely different things. The restraining order meant I couldn't approach them directly, couldn't call or write or show up at their new home in Louisville. The death certificate meant Emma believed I was gone forever, that any attempt to contact her would be seen as either a miracle or a trauma, depending on how you looked at it. And Bobby was somewhere out there, isolated from everyone who might help him see what his wife really was, probably believing that his mother had died alone and forgotten while he was building his new life. I spent the next 3 years in a kind of living hell, watching from a distance as my granddaughter grew up without me, seeing glimpses of her life through public records and social media posts that Jimmy helped me access. Those photos were like knives in my heart. Emma at school events, birthday parties, soccer games, looking happy and healthy but somehow different from the joyful child I remembered. There was something more careful about her smile, more controlled, like she'd learned to be what other people wanted instead of simply being herself. During those long, painful years of exile, I found unexpected solace in a support group for estranged grandparents that met every Thursday evening at the community center on Broadway. I discovered I wasn't alone in my nightmare. There were dozens of women in Frankfurt and the surrounding counties who'd been cut off from their grandchildren by daughters-in-law and sons-in-law, who saw them as threats rather than resources, problems to be solved rather than family members to be treasured. We shared stories that were heartbreakingly similar. The gradual erosion of access, the twisted accusations, the legal barriers that transformed loving grandparents into legal strangers overnight. Some had been fighting for years, spending their life savings on lawyers who promised reunion, but delivered only more paperwork and legal bills. Others had given up entirely, resigned to watching their grandchildren grow up through glimpses on social media and occasional sightings at the grocery store or shopping mall. Margaret Williams had been cut off from her grandson for 5 years because her daughter-in-law claimed she was too religious and might damage the child's psychological development. Helen Foster hadn't seen her granddaughter in 3 years because she'd questioned, whether the child needed medication for behavioral problems that Helen remembered as normal 5-year-old energy. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its pain. The bewilderment of loving grandparents who'd done nothing wrong except exist as reminders of their children's pasts and alternative sources of authority in their grandchildren's lives. But I couldn't give up. Wouldn't resign myself to being a footnote in Emma's life story. Every morning, I woke up thinking about her, wondering what she was learning in school, whether she still loved the fairy tales I used to read to her, if she ever asked about the grandmother she thought was buried in Frankfurt Cemetery. I kept her room in my apartment exactly as it had been during those brief, precious visits when she was a toddler. Books on the shelf, toys in the basket, a child-sized rocking chair by the window where we used to watch the birds together, and I'd tell her their names and habits. It became a shrine to a relationship that had been murdered by jealousy and control, a museum of memories that kept my love alive even when it had nowhere to go. The breaking point came when Emma turned 8 years old. I'd been dead to her for 5 years, longer than she'd known me alive, and I realized that if I waited much longer, she'd be a teenager, then an adult, and I'd have missed her entire childhood. The window for making her remember me, for rekindling the bond we'd shared, was closing with each passing day. I had to find a way to let her know the truth, even if it meant risking everything I had left, even if it meant violating the restraining order and facing legal consequences. That's when I decided to write the letter that would either destroy my last hope of seeing Emma again, or open the door to the reunion I'd been praying for every night for 5 years. The letter took me 3 weeks to write. Draft after draft, spread across my kitchen table as I tried to find the right words, the perfect balance between truth and kindness, between hope and caution. How do you tell an 8-year-old that her grandmother isn't really dead without destroying her entire understanding of the world? How do you explain that the mother she trusts has been lying to her about something so fundamental? I finally settled on a simple approach. I would tell her stories that only her real grandmother would know, memories from before I was dead, and let her curious, intelligent mind draw its own conclusions about what those memories might mean. I included photos of us together, pictures that Vanessa couldn't have destroyed because I'd kept the copies in my own albums, snapshots of Emma's first birthday, where she'd gotten chocolate cake all over her face, and I was laughing as I tried to clean her up with a washcloth, another showing her learning to walk and taking those precious first steps into my waiting arms. I wrote about the songs we used to sing together, word for word, the lullabies that had been passed down through my family for generations. I described the stories I used to tell her about her father's childhood, specific incidents that only someone who'd raised Bobby would know. The time he'd gotten his head stuck in the porch railing and cried until I freed him with dish soap. The Halloween when he'd insisted on being a ghost, but was too scared to go trick-or-treating. I included details about the special cookies we made every Christmas, the exact recipe, and the way Emma used to stand on a chair beside me, wearing one of my aprons that dragged on the floor, carefully measuring flour with her tiny hands. These were memories that no stranger could invent, proof that I had been real, that our love had been real, that the bond between us had existed even if everyone said I was gone. Instead of sending the letter directly to Emma, which would have violated the restraining order and probably gotten me arrested, I mailed it to Frankfurt Elementary School with a carefully crafted cover letter explaining that it was reference material for a family heritage project. I'd researched the 3rd grade curriculum online and knew they'd be studying family trees and genealogy that month, learning about their ancestors and family traditions. I hoped a teacher would hand it to Emma as educational material, that she'd read it in the safety of her classroom, where Vanessa couldn't monitor every word or control her reaction. 3 months after I sent the letter, Jimmy called with news that made my heart race and my hands shake as I held the phone. "She got it," he said. his voice excited for the first time since I'd hired him. "Emma got your letter, and according to my contact at the school, she's been asking questions about her father's family, wanting to know more about relatives she's never met. She even asked her teacher if people can come back from the dead, if it's possible for someone to not really be gone, even if everyone thinks they are. The seed had been planted, but would it grow in soil poisoned by years of lies and manipulation? I had to believe that love was stronger than deception, that the bond we'd shared in those early years had left an indelible mark on Emma's heart that couldn't be completely erased by time or distance. What I didn't know was that my letter had arrived at the perfect moment, when Emma was already beginning to question the stories she'd been told about her family. She'd been wondering why she had no relatives on her father's side, why there were no photos of grandparents or aunts and uncles in their Louisville house like her classmates had in theirs. Children have an instinct for truth that's hard to suppress completely, and Emma's was finally beginning to stir after years of careful suppression. The war for my granddaughter's heart was about to enter its final phase, and this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. Emma herself had become my unknowing ally, her natural curiosity and intelligence, working to uncover the lies that had separated us. The dead grandmother was about to come back to life, and nothing would ever be the same again for any of us. 4 months after I sent the letter, Jimmy called with news that sent my heart soaring and crashing at the same time. "Emma Henderson has been asking her father direct questions about you," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "My contact says Bobby looked like he'd seen a ghost when she showed him some old photos she'd found, and asked why nobody ever talks about Grandma Dottie anymore, why there are no pictures of her in their house, why she doesn't have any stories about her, like other kids do about their grandmothers. After 8 years of being dead, I was suddenly a topic of conversation in my son's house again, a mystery that my granddaughter was determined to solve. But the reaction wasn't what I'd expected or hoped for. Instead of Bobby reaching out to me, instead of questions that might lead to answers and eventual reunion, Jimmy reported increased security measures at their Louisville home. New locks, security cameras, motion sensors, and what looked like preparation for another move. Vanessa was circling the wagons, trying to protect her carefully constructed version of reality from the truth that was threatening to break through Emma's innocent questions. That's when I made the decision that would either reunite me with my family or destroy any chance I had left of ever seeing Emma again. I was going to Frankfort Cemetery to visit my own grave, to see how they'd memorialized the woman I was supposed to be, what lies were carved into stone with my name on them. If I was going to fight back, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against. The gravestone was modest but expensive. Gray granite with elegant lettering that must have cost more than I spent on food in 6 months. Just my name and the wrong dates, with a simple inscription that made my stomach turn. Loving mother and grandmother, at peace with the angels. No mention of my maiden name, my parents, or any of the family history that defined who I really was. It was a generic marker for a generic death, as impersonal as everything else Vanessa had done to erase my real identity from Emma's life. But as I stood there reading my own epitaph, struggling with the surreal experience of mourning myself, I wasn't alone. A small figure emerged from behind a nearby monument, and my heart stopped beating entirely. Emma, my granddaughter, now 8 years old and beautiful, in ways that made my chest ache with pride and devastating loss. She was taller, her baby face replaced by the features of a real little person, but her eyes were still the same blue that reminded me of Harold, still curious and intelligent, despite everything that had been done to limit her world. "Are you here to visit someone too?" she asked with the polite curiosity of a child who'd been raised to be respectful to strangers, her voice carrying traces of the accent she was picking up from her Louisville classmates. I couldn't speak for a moment, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the impossibility of this moment. Here was my granddaughter standing at my fake grave, talking to me like I was just another mourner instead of the woman whose love she'd been taught to forget, whose existence had been erased from her family history. "I'm visiting my grandmother," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had brought her to me. "She died when I was little, but I still come here sometimes to talk to her, to tell her about my life." Emma nodded seriously, the gesture so reminiscent of Bobby at that age that it took my breath away. "I visit my daddy's mom too, right here." She pointed to my gravestone with a small hand that I remembered kissing when she was a baby. "I never really knew her because she died when I was really little, but Mommy says she loved me very much before she went to heaven." The irony was devastating and perfect at the same time. My granddaughter was visiting my grave to remember a woman she thought was dead, while that same woman stood 5 feet away, desperate to hold her, but legally forbidden from revealing the truth. The conversation that followed was the most important and heartbreaking of my entire life. "What do you remember about her?" I asked, needing to know what pieces of our relationship had survived Vanessa's systematic destruction, what fragments of love had managed to hide in the corners of an 8-year-old's heart. Emma's face scrunched up in concentration, the same expression she'd made as a toddler when I asked her to remember where she'd put her favorite toy. "Not much, really. I was too little. But sometimes I have dreams about someone singing to me, songs that Mommy doesn't know and can't find on the internet. And I remember being really, really happy for no reason, like everything was perfect even when I was just sitting in someone's lap," she remembered. Somewhere deep in her 8-year-old soul, Emma carried traces of our love, fragments of the bond that had been severed but not completely destroyed. Those songs were the lullabies I'd sung to her every night during those precious months when she lived in my house, the melodies that had carried my love into her dreams, even after I was forbidden to sing them anymore. "I bet she still loves you," I said, tears threatening to spill over and give away everything I was trying to hide. "Even from heaven, I bet she thinks about you every single day and wishes she could hold you again. Wishes she could see what a beautiful, smart girl you've become." Emma smiled then, the first completely genuine smile I'd seen from her since she was 2 years old. Bright and trusting and innocent, in a way that made my heart break and soar at the same time. "Do you really think dead people can hear us when we talk to them?" she asked, her voice full of hope and longing that told me everything I needed to know about the hole my absence had left in her life. "I think love is stronger than death," I told her, speaking the absolute truth even though she couldn't understand the full meaning of my words. "I think the people who love us never really leave us, even when we can't see them anymore. They live on in our hearts, in our memories, in the songs we sing, and the stories we tell." We stood there together for 20 more precious minutes, my granddaughter and I, separated by lies but connected by a love that had survived 8 years of systematic destruction. She told me about school, about her friends, about the book she was reading for a class project. I listened to every word like it was music, storing up each detail to treasure later in the lonely hours when she was gone again. When she finally left, skipping back toward the cemetery entrance where Vanessa was probably waiting in the car, checking her watch and wondering what was taking so long, I knew what I had to do. The charade had gone on long enough. Emma was old enough to start questioning the stories she'd been told, mature enough to handle at least part of the truth, and clearly hungry for the connection that had been stolen from her. I was going to fight for my granddaughter with everything I had left, even if it meant risking arrest, legal consequences, or complete and final rejection. But first, I needed to find a way to get Bobby alone, away from Vanessa's influence and manipulation, to show him what his wife had really done to our family. The dead grandmother was about to come back to life, and this time, she wasn't going quietly into anyone's version of the night. My resurrection was about to begin, and nothing Vanessa Claire Morrison Henderson could do would stop the truth from finally setting us all free. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story touched your heart and showed you the power of a grandmother's love that can survive even the cruelest deceptions. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us so much. Every day we bring new emotional stories about life, so feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, we want to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story.